This story is a work of fiction, created for entertainment purposes only. All characters, events, and situations are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real people or real events is purely coincidental.
The great emperor stood alone on the balcony of the imperial palace, watching the entire capital bow beneath him. Every light that flickered in the city below belonged to someone who feared his name, obeyed his word, and would die at his command. He had conquered nations, crushed rebellions, and rewritten the borders of the known world. His empire stretched farther than any emperor before him had ever dared to dream. But standing there in the cold silence of absolute power, he felt nothing. Not pride, not satisfaction, just the hollow echo of a heart that had stopped beating for anything real a long time ago. He had learned years ago that attachment was weakness, that to love something was to give it the power to destroy you. So he had built walls higher than any fortress, colder than any winter, and more impenetrable than the iron gates that protected his throne. And inside those walls, he had buried the last remnants of the man he used to be. She had entered his life like a whisper, no grand entrance, no claim to greatness. Just a young woman assigned to serve in the outer chambers of the palace, invisible to everyone who mattered. He never intended to notice her, but there was something about the way she moved through the world. Quiet, careful, as if she had learned long ago that taking up space was dangerous. She never asked for anything, never looked at him with expectation or ambition. She simply existed in the margins of his empire, tending to tasks no one else cared about, speaking only when spoken to, and disappearing the moment her presence was no longer required. And yet somehow, in all that silence, she had become the only thing in his empire that didn't feel like a performance. When she was near, the weight of the crown felt lighter. When she looked at him, he didn't see fear or calculation. He saw something he had forgotten existed. He saw someone who might have cared about the man beneath the title, but caring was dangerous, and he had spent too many years convincing himself that he didn't need it. So when the moment came to choose, when the council pressured him to secure an alliance through marriage, when the rival empire sent their envoys, when the entire court waited to see who the great emperor would finally claim as his own, he did what he always did. He made the strategic choice, the cold choice, the choice that protected his empire and required nothing from his heart. He rejected her, not cruelly, not publicly, just quietly, in the way powerful men dismiss things they've decided don't matter. And she had stood there, in the shadows where she always stood, and absorbed that rejection like she had absorbed every other wound life had given her, without protest, without tears. She simply nodded, stepped back, and faded into the background once more. He told himself it was the right decision, that she would understand, that she would remain where she had always been, close enough to remember, far enough to forget. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have predicted, was that someone else had been watching, someone who saw what he had refused to see, and that someone was about to take from him the one thing his empire could never replace. The great emperor had not always been alone. Once, long ago, he had been a younger man with softer edges and a heart that still believed in loyalty beyond strategy. He had loved someone then, a woman whose name he no longer spoke aloud, whose memory had been carefully buried beneath years of conquest and control. She had died because he had been too weak to protect her, too inexperienced to see the betrayal coming, too foolish to understand that love made you a target. The pain of losing her had taught him the most important lesson of his life, that to rule an empire, you must first kill the part of yourself that can be hurt. So he had done exactly that. He had carved out his own heart and replaced it with iron will and calculated distance. And for 20 years it had worked perfectly. His days followed the same rhythm. Dawn broke over the empire, and he rose before the sun touched the palace walls. He reviewed military reports, signed edicts, received foreign delegations, and made decisions that altered the fates of millions without ever feeling the weight of a single life. His advisors spoke in careful tones, measuring every word to avoid his displeasure. His generals obeyed without question. His enemies feared him so deeply that most surrendered before the first blade was drawn. He had become exactly what an emperor should be: untouchable, unshakable, and utterly alone. But somewhere along the way, the isolation that had once felt like strength had begun to feel like suffocation. He would sit in the throne room surrounded by hundreds of people and feel as though he were sealed inside a tomb. He could command armies, but he could not command a single genuine smile. He could take anything he wanted, but he had stopped wanting anything at all. She had arrived at the palace 3 years ago, part of a group of young women selected to serve in the lower chambers. He didn't remember her arrival. Didn't remember her name being read aloud, or her face among the others. She was simply there one day, quietly refilling wine during a council meeting, moving along the edges of the room like a shadow that had learned not to disturb the light. Most servants in the palace performed their duties with visible anxiety, hyper-aware of every gesture, every glance from those in power. But she was different. She moved with a kind of resigned grace, as if she had already accepted that she would never matter enough to be truly seen. And perhaps that's why he noticed her. Because she was the only person in his empire who didn't seem to want anything from him. She didn't flinch when he entered a room, didn't freeze when his gaze passed over her. She simply continued her work, silent and steady, as if his presence changed nothing about her world. Over time, he began to notice small things. The way she arranged flowers in the council chamber, never ornate, never showy, just simple and unexpectedly beautiful. The way she listened when others spoke, even when no one was speaking to her, absorbing conversations as if every word mattered. The way she moved through the palace, always aware of where she was needed, always anticipating tasks before they were asked of her, not out of ambition, but out of some quiet instinct to be useful. He found himself watching for her in rooms where she had no reason to be, found himself aware of her absence when she wasn't there. It wasn't desire, not in the way he understood it. It was something quieter, something that felt dangerously close to comfort. And comfort, he had learned long ago, was just another word for vulnerability. So he did what he always did when something threatened to breach his walls. He ignored it. He told himself she was just another servant, interchangeable with 100 others. That whatever he thought he felt was simply the loneliness of power playing tricks on his mind. But then came the night of the winter feast, when the entire court gathered to celebrate the empire's latest victory. The hall blazed with torches and gold, filled with laughter and music and the false warmth of people pretending to enjoy each other's company. He sat on his throne, alone as always, watching the performance unfold before him. And then he saw her, standing near the far wall, holding a tray she had just set down. She wasn't watching the dancers or the acrobats. She was watching him, not with longing or ambition, not with the calculated interest of someone seeking favor. She was watching him the way someone might watch a distant star, something beautiful and untouchable and impossibly far away. And for just a moment, their eyes met across the crowded hall. She didn't look away, didn't lower her gaze in submission. She just held his eyes for 3 long seconds, and in that brief silence, something passed between them that he couldn't name. Then she turned and disappeared into the shadows, and he was left with the unsettling realization that for the first time in 20 years, he had felt seen by someone who had no reason to see him at all. After that night, he found himself assigning her to tasks that kept her closer to his private chambers. He told himself it was practical. She was efficient, quiet, unobtrusive. But the truth was something he refused to examine too closely. He wanted her near. Not to possess her, not even to speak to her. Just to know she was there. She became part of the rhythm of his days in a way no one else had been in years. She would enter his study in the early morning to light the fire, moving so quietly he barely heard her. She would leave tea on his desk when he worked late into the night, always at the exact moment he needed it, never asking if he wanted it. She anticipated his needs without ever making him feel observed or controlled. And somehow, in all that silence, she made the palace feel less like a mausoleum and more like a place where a human being actually lived. He began to notice things about her that no emperor should notice about a servant. The way her hands trembled slightly when she poured wine during council meetings, not from fear, but from the cold that seeped into the stone halls during winter. The way she bit her lower lip when she concentrated on arranging scrolls in his study, a small gesture that made her seem younger and more fragile than he'd realized. The way she never looked at herself in the mirrors that lined the palace corridors, as if she had learned long ago that her reflection held no value worth examining. He learned, through fragments of overheard conversations, that she had been brought to the palace after her family fell into debt, that she had no protectors, no allies, no path forward except the one that kept her useful and invisible. She existed in a strange limbo, neither slave nor free, neither valued nor disposable, just present in the way furniture is present. And that realization stirred something in him he thought he'd buried forever. Not pity. Something deeper. Something that felt dangerously close to recognition. One afternoon, he found her in the palace library, a place servants were technically forbidden from entering unless summoned for cleaning. She was standing in front of a shelf of old histories, her fingers tracing the spines of books she would never be allowed to read. She hadn't heard him enter. For a long moment, he simply watched her. This young woman who moved through his empire like a ghost, standing in front of knowledge she would never be permitted to touch. Then she sensed his presence and turned, her face draining of color. She dropped into a low bow immediately, her voice barely a whisper as she apologized for the intrusion. But he didn't reprimand her. Instead, he did something he couldn't quite explain. He walked to the shelf, pulled down the book her fingers had been reaching for, and placed it in her hands. He said nothing, didn't explain himself, didn't wait for her thanks. He simply left the library, leaving her standing there with the book clutched against her chest, her eyes wide with confusion and something that looked almost like hope. After that, he began leaving books in places where she would find them. On the table in his study after she had finished her morning tasks. On the bench in the garden where she sometimes sat during her brief moments of rest. He never mentioned them. Never asked if she had read them. But he knew she did, because he would find them returned to different shelves in the library, always carefully placed, always exactly where they belonged. It became a secret language between them, this exchange of stories and ideas that required no words. She never thanked him directly, never acknowledged the gift. But sometimes when she entered his study in the morning, there would be the faintest hint of a smile on her lips, so small and fleeting that anyone else would have missed it. But he didn't miss it. He had become attuned to her in ways that terrified him. He knew the rhythm of her breathing when she stood near him, knew the exact moment she would enter a room before she arrived, knew when she was tired or cold or struggling with something she would never voice aloud. And that's when he realized he had made a terrible mistake. He had allowed her to become essential, not to his empire, not to his strategy or his power, but to him. To the man beneath the crown, the one he had spent 20 years trying to erase. She had slipped past every defense he had built, not through seduction or manipulation, but through simple, relentless presence. She had made him feel human again. And humanity, for a man like him, was the most dangerous thing in the world. Because the moment you allowed yourself to care about something, you gave the world a weapon to destroy you. He had learned that lesson once, in blood and grief and irreversible loss. He had sworn never to learn it again. So he made a decision. He would create distance. He would remind himself and her of the natural order. He would stop leaving books, stop watching for her in the mornings, stop allowing himself to feel the warmth that spread through his chest when she was near. He would go back to being the emperor he was supposed to be, alone, untouchable, and safe from the unbearable vulnerability of being known. The council meeting arrived like a storm he had seen forming on the horizon for months. His advisors had been pressing him for years to secure a political marriage, to bind the empire's future to another power through blood and alliance. He had deflected, delayed, dismissed every proposal with the cold efficiency of a man who needed no one. But the pressure had reached a breaking point. The rival empire to the east had grown stronger, their new emperor consolidating power and expanding influence in ways that threatened the delicate balance of the region. His generals warned of inevitable conflict. His diplomats spoke of opportunities for peace through union. And his oldest advisor, a man who had served his father before him, finally spoke the words that changed everything. "You have built the greatest empire the world has ever known, but empires do not survive on conquest alone. They survive through legacy. And you, my lord, have no heir, no successor, no future beyond your own life." The words landed like stones in still water, rippling outward into every corner of his carefully constructed world. He had spent so long focused on the present, on maintaining control, on ensuring that nothing and no one could ever hurt him again, that he had never stopped to consider what would happen when he was gone. His empire, everything he had built, would collapse into civil war the moment he died. Rival claimants would tear the realm apart. Everything he had sacrificed, everything he had become, would dissolve into chaos and bloodshed. Unless he did what every emperor before him had done. Unless he chose a consort, produced an heir, and secured the future through the same cold calculation he had applied to every other aspect of his rule. The logic was undeniable. The strategy was sound. And yet, for the first time in his life as emperor, he felt something close to resistance rising in his chest, because choosing a political marriage meant closing a door he hadn't realized he'd left open. It meant accepting that whatever he felt when she entered a room, whatever warmth spread through him when she was near, was nothing more than a temporary delusion that had to end. The proposals arrived in sealed documents, each one representing a potential alliance with another great house or neighboring empire. Daughters of kings, sisters of warlords, widows of fallen rulers, women of power and influence, women who understood the game, women who would never expect love because they had been raised to understand that power was the only currency that mattered. He reviewed each proposal with the same clinical detachment he applied to battle strategies. He noted bloodlines, political advantages, potential threats. He made lists. He weighed options. And through it all, he felt a growing numbness spreading through him, as if some part of him were slowly shutting down in preparation for what he knew he had to do. He told himself this was what emperors did. This was the price of the crown. Personal desires were irrelevant. Personal feelings were weakness. He had always known this. He had always accepted it. So why did it feel this time like he was betraying something sacred? She continued her duties as always, unaware of the decision taking shape in the halls of power. He watched her move through the palace, still quiet, still invisible to everyone but him, and felt the weight of what he was about to do pressing down on his chest like a physical thing. He could have told her. Could have explained that the world of emperors and empires left no room for the kind of connection they had built in silence. Could have given her the dignity of understanding why he had to choose duty over whatever this fragile, unnamed thing between them was. But he didn't, because telling her would have required admitting out loud that there was something to lose. And he had spent too many years convincing himself that he was incapable of loss, that he had armored himself so thoroughly that nothing could reach him anymore. So instead, he simply stopped. Stopped leaving books, stopped watching for her, stopped allowing himself to feel the momentary peace that came when she was near. He withdrew into the coldest version of himself, the version that had conquered nations and crushed rebellions without a single moment of doubt. The day he made his choice, she was in his study, as she had been every morning for the past 2 years. She was lighting the fire, her movements careful and practiced, her presence so familiar it had become part of the room itself. He sat at his desk, the signed treaty in front of him, the decision made and sealed. He didn't look at her. Couldn't look at her. He simply spoke, his voice flat and empty of everything he refused to feel. You will be reassigned to the outer chambers. Effective immediately. The words hung in the air like a blade suspended between them. He heard her hands still on the firewood, heard the nearly imperceptible intake of breath that told him she understood exactly what those words meant. But she didn't question him. Didn't ask why. She simply stood, bowed in that same quiet way she had always bowed, and whispered, "Yes, my lord." And then she left. Just walked out of his study, out of his daily life, out of the small orbit of proximity they had shared. And he sat there, alone in the silence she left behind, telling himself he had done the right thing, that this was protection, that distance was mercy, that he had saved them both from the inevitable pain of wanting something the world would never allow them to have. The days after her reassignment felt longer than they should have. He told himself it was simply an adjustment period, that he had grown accustomed to a particular routine and now needed time to adapt to a new one. A different servant brought his tea in the mornings, an older woman who moved efficiently but without the instinctive awareness that had made every interaction with her feel seamless. The fire was lit at the same time, the scrolls were organized in the same way, the room was maintained with the same level of care, but something fundamental had changed. The study felt emptier. The silence felt heavier. He would catch himself listening for footsteps that never came, looking toward the door at the exact moment she used to arrive, and then remembering, with a dull ache he refused to name, that she wouldn't be coming anymore. He had created this distance deliberately. He had chosen it. So why did it feel like he had amputated part of himself? His political marriage was announced to the empire with all the ceremony and grandeur expected of such an occasion. The woman he had chosen was everything an empress should be: intelligent, poised, born into power and trained to wield it. She understood statecraft. She spoke 4 languages. She carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from a lifetime of knowing she mattered. Their first meeting was cordial and strategic, 2 leaders assessing each other across a table laden with maps and treaties. She asked intelligent questions about the empire's military capabilities. He provided measured answers about trade routes and defensive positions. They discussed timelines for the wedding, arrangements for her household, the political optics of the union. It was a negotiation, clean and efficient, exactly the kind of interaction he excelled at. And yet, as he sat across from this brilliant, powerful woman who would soon share his title and his throne, he felt absolutely nothing. No anticipation, no curiosity, not even the mild interest he might feel toward a new advisor or general. He tried to convince himself that this absence of feeling was actually ideal. That emotion had no place in political marriages. That what he had with her, mutual respect, shared goals, compatible intellects, was far more valuable than the irrational pull of attraction or affection. He had seen love destroy empires, had watched his father's devotion to his mother cloud his judgment during critical moments of war, had learned, through his own devastating loss, that caring deeply about someone gave them the power to unmake you completely. So this emptiness, this careful distance, was exactly what he needed. It was safe. It was sustainable. It was the smart choice. But late at night, alone in his chambers, he would find himself thinking about the way she used to move through his study. Not his future empress, but the girl he had sent away. The way she had listened to his silence as if it were conversation. The way her presence had made the unbearable weight of ruling feel, for brief moments, almost bearable. He saw her occasionally from a distance, in hallways or courtyards, as he moved through the palace. She had been reassigned to the kitchens, work that kept her far from the imperial chambers and deeper in the servant quarters where nobles rarely ventured. She looked smaller somehow, as if the reassignment had diminished her in ways that went beyond physical space. She never looked up when he passed, never acknowledged his presence. She had returned to being what she had always been to everyone else: invisible, forgettable, just another face in the endless stream of servants who kept the empire functioning. And he told himself this was better. That she would be safer this way, removed from the scrutiny and danger that came with proximity to power. That he had protected her by pushing her away. But protection, he was beginning to realize, was just another word for abandonment. He had convinced himself he was saving her from the pain of wanting something impossible. But maybe what he had really done was confirm every terrible thing she had ever believed about herself. That she would never be chosen, never be valued, never matter enough to be worth the risk. The wedding preparations consumed the palace. Seamstresses worked day and night on the empress's ceremonial robes. Architects designed elaborate additions to the throne room. Chefs planned feasts that would feed thousands. Diplomats arrived from across the known world, eager to witness the union that would reshape the balance of power for generations. He moved through it all with mechanical precision, approving designs, greeting dignitaries, playing the role of the emperor securing his legacy. But inside, in the part of himself he had tried so hard to kill, something was beginning to crack. He would stand on the balcony where this entire story had begun, looking out over his empire, and feel a loneliness so profound it took his breath away. He had everything a man could want: absolute power, unlimited wealth, the respect and fear of millions. A brilliant woman about to become his empress, a future finally secured. And yet, standing there in the cold night air, he felt like the poorest man alive. Because the one thing that had made him feel human, the one person who had seen him as something more than a crown and a title, was gone. And he had sent her away with his own hands. The rival emperor arrived 3 weeks before the wedding, leading a delegation from the Eastern Empire that had been both ally and threat for the past decade. His name was spoken with a mixture of respect and caution, a younger ruler who had inherited a fractured realm, and against all expectations, unified it through strategy rather than bloodshed. He was different from the great emperor in almost every way. Where one ruled through fear and distance, the other led through presence and careful observation. Where one had built walls around himself, the other seemed to move through the world with an openness that borders on dangerous. They had never met in person before, only exchanged letters and envoys, their relationship defined by careful diplomacy and the unspoken understanding that they were the two most powerful men in the known world. And now, for the first time, they stood face to face in the throne room, two emperors measuring each other across a space thick with political tension and unspoken competition. The greeting was formal, as protocol demanded. They exchanged words of mutual respect, spoke of strengthening bonds between their empires, acknowledged the historic significance of this gathering. But beneath the diplomatic language, there was something else. A quiet assessment, the kind that happens when two apex predators share the same territory and must decide whether to coexist or destroy each other. The great emperor watched his rival carefully, noting the way he carried himself with confidence but without arrogance, the way he listened more than he spoke, the way his eyes tracked not just the emperor himself but everyone in the room, absorbing details most rulers would overlook. This was a man who paid attention, who saw things others missed, and that made him far more dangerous than any warlord who relied solely on military might. The great emperor had conquered through overwhelming force and strategic brilliance, but this man, he sensed, conquered through understanding, and that was a different kind of power entirely. The rival emperor had requested accommodations for his delegation within the palace, a customary courtesy extended to visiting rulers. The great emperor granted it without hesitation, assigning them to the East Wing and ensuring they were treated with all the honors due to their station. Over the following days, the rival emperor moved through the palace with a quiet curiosity, observing court proceedings, attending planning sessions for the upcoming wedding, engaging in conversations that seemed casual but were undoubtedly strategic. He was charming in a way the great emperor had never learned to be, warm but not false, interested but not invasive, present in a way that made people feel seen without feeling exposed. And everywhere he went, he watched. Not with the cold calculation of someone gathering intelligence for war, but with the genuine interest of someone who believed that understanding people was the key to understanding power. He asked servants their names, noticed when guards changed shifts, observed the small hierarchies and dynamics that structured palace life beneath the surface of imperial grandeur. It was during a state dinner, 5 days into his visit, that the rival emperor first saw her. She was serving wine to the lower tables, moving through the crowded hall with that same quiet efficiency the great emperor had once found so compelling. She was no longer assigned to his personal service, so she had no reason to come near the high table where the emperors sat. But the rival emperor's eyes found her anyway, tracking her movement through the room with an attention that made the great emperor's chest tighten in a way he didn't understand. At first, he thought perhaps the rival emperor was simply observing the staff, cataloging the palace's operations as he seemed to catalog everything else. But then he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The rival emperor wasn't just looking at her, he was seeing her, really seeing her, in the way most people looked at things they found unexpectedly beautiful. And when she passed close enough to refill his cup, the rival emperor did something no one else in that entire hall had done. He thanked her. Not with the absent courtesy of someone acknowledging a servant's function, but with genuine warmth, his eyes meeting hers for just a moment before she bowed and moved away. The great emperor watched this brief interaction with a feeling he couldn't name rising in his throat. It was such a small thing, a simple thank you. Eye contact that lasted barely 2 seconds. But something about it felt profoundly threatening. Because in that moment, he saw his rival do what he himself had been too afraid to do, acknowledge her humanity without hesitation or calculation. The rival emperor didn't seem to care that she was a servant, didn't seem troubled by the vast distance between their stations. He had simply seen someone worth seeing and had responded with natural kindness. And the great emperor realized, with dawning horror, that this man was everything he had trained himself not to be. Open where he was closed. Present where he was distant, willing to see value in places where protocol said value shouldn't exist. For the rest of the dinner, he found himself watching them both. His rival, who seemed increasingly aware of her presence in the room, and her who moved through her duties with no apparent awareness that she had been noticed at all. But the great emperor knew better. He had learned to read her in the silent language they had once shared. and he could see in the slight stiffness of her shoulders, the careful way she avoided that section of the hall, that she had felt the weight of that gaze and didn't know what to do with it. The rival emperor began asking questions, casual questions, woven into conversations with advisors and courtiers, questions that seemed innocent but carried a specific focus. He asked about the palace's history, about the people who kept it running, about traditions and hierarchies that most visiting dignitaries never cared to understand. And then, during a private meeting ostensibly about trade agreements, he asked the question that changed everything. The young woman who served wine at dinner last night, she has an unusual grace about her. What is her story? The great emperor felt every muscle in his body tense. He kept his face neutral, his voice controlled as he responded with deliberate vagueness. There are many servants in the palace. I don't concern myself with their individual histories. But the rival emperor smiled, a small knowing smile that suggested he understood exactly what that deflection meant. Of course, he said quietly. Forgive my curiosity. I have a habit of noticing those whom others overlook. Over the next several days, the rival emperor made it his business to encounter her. Not obviously, not in ways that would draw attention or violate protocol, but he began taking walks through parts of the palace where servants worked. He would visit the kitchens under the pretense of complimenting the chef. He would linger in gardens where staff took their brief moments of rest. And somehow, in all these carefully orchestrated movements, he would find himself in her vicinity. At first, she seemed oblivious to the pattern. She would bow when he passed, keep her eyes lowered, continue with her work as if his presence meant nothing. But the rival emperor was patient. He didn't press, didn't force conversation. He simply made himself present, creating a space where, eventually, interaction became natural rather than intrusive. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to notice. Began to anticipate his presence in the same way she had once anticipated the great emperor's needs. The first real conversation happened in the palace library, in the same space where the great emperor had once given her that first book. She was returning volumes to their shelves, a task she had volunteered for, because it gave her access to the stories that had become her only escape. She didn't hear him enter, but when she turned, he was there, standing near the doorway with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at the shelves with genuine interest. "Do you have a favorite?" he asked, his voice gentle and without presumption. She froze, uncertain how to respond. Servants didn't have favorites. Servants didn't have opinions about books they weren't supposed to be reading in the first place. But something about the way he asked, not as a test, not as a trap, but as if her answer actually mattered, made her speak. "The histories," she said quietly. "The ones about empires that rose and fell. I like knowing that even the most powerful things eventually change." He smiled at that, a real smile that reached his eyes. "So do I," he said. "It's humbling, isn't it? To remember that all of this," he gestured vaguely at the palace around them, "is temporary." From that moment, something shifted. He began leaving books for her, just as the great emperor once had. But unlike the great emperor, he didn't hide it. He would hand them to her directly, in passing with a simple, "I thought you might enjoy this." He asked her name, and when she told him, he used it. Not in the careless way nobles sometimes used servants' names to demonstrate false familiarity, but with respect, as if her identity mattered. He asked about her thoughts on the books she read, listened when she answered, engaged with her ideas as if they came from an equal rather than someone far beneath his station. And through all of this, he never once made her feel exposed or vulnerable. He created a strange kind of safety around their interactions, a space where she could exist as herself rather than as the invisible servant everyone else needed her to be. The great emperor watched all of this from a distance, his jaw tight, his hands clenched, feeling something dark and terrible growing in his chest that he absolutely refused to call jealousy. What made it unbearable was the way she responded. Slowly, carefully, like a flower turning toward unexpected sunlight, she began to open. The hardness that had settled over her after her reassignment started to soften. She smiled more, spoke with less hesitation, carried herself with something that looked almost like hope. The great emperor could see her transformation happening in real time, could see her becoming the version of herself she might have been if the world had been kinder, if someone had chosen her before she learned to stop believing she could be chosen. And the worst part, the part that made him want to tear down the entire palace with his bare hands, was that she deserved this, deserved to be seen and valued and treated like her thoughts and feelings mattered. He had known that, had felt it in every moment they had shared. But he had been too afraid, too controlled by fear and strategy and the belief that caring was weakness. And now someone else, someone braver, someone better, was giving her what he had been too much of a coward to offer. The rival emperor wasn't taking her from him. He was simply being willing to choose her when the great emperor had chosen to let her go. The wedding preparations reached their final week. The palace transformed into something that resembled a stage, set more than a residence. Every surface polished, every detail perfected for the thousands of guests who would witness the union of two great empires. The woman who would become empress moved through it all with practiced grace, reviewing seating arrangements, approving floral designs, playing her role with the competence of someone who had been trained for this her entire life. She and the great emperor had settled into a kind of professional partnership, cordial, efficient, completely devoid of warmth. They discussed politics and strategy. They planned the future of their combined realms. They never touched unless protocol demanded it. They never spoke of anything personal. And both seemed perfectly content with this arrangement. It was exactly what a political marriage should be. Exactly what he had always believed he wanted. So why did he feel like he was suffocating? The rival emperor requested a private audience 2 days before the ceremony. They met in the great emperor's study, the same room where she had once lit fires and left tea and moved through his mornings like a quiet prayer. The rival emperor entered with his usual calm confidence, but there was something different in his bearing now, a gravity that suggested this conversation would be unlike the carefully diplomatic exchanges they had shared until now. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I need to speak with you about a matter of great personal importance," he said, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of something the great emperor couldn't quite identify. "I have come to care deeply for someone in your household, and before I act on that regard, I wanted to extend you the courtesy of speaking with you directly, as one emperor to another." The words landed like stones in deep water. The great emperor knew, with absolute certainty, who he meant. But he forced himself to ask anyway, his voice carefully controlled. "Who?" The rival emperor met his eyes without flinching. "The young woman who works in your kitchens, the one who reads histories in the library. Her name is—" "I know her name," the great emperor interrupted, the words coming out sharper than he intended. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken truths. The rival emperor studied him for a long moment, and the great emperor could see understanding dawn in those observant eyes. "You care for her," the rival emperor said quietly. It wasn't a question. The great emperor wanted to deny it, wanted to say that emperors didn't care about servants, that personal feelings were irrelevant, that he had already made his choice and it had nothing to do with her. But something about the directness of the moment, the weight of standing before another man who saw through every defense, made the lies die in his throat. "What I feel is irrelevant," he said finally. "I have made commitments that cannot be undone. My path is set." The rival emperor nodded slowly, as if this answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "Then you won't object if I pursue her? If I offer her a choice you chose not to give?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Every instinct the great emperor had honed over 20 years of ruling screamed at him to say no, to assert his authority, to claim her as his own even if he had no intention of actually choosing her. But what right did he have? He had pushed her away, had reduced her to invisibility, had chosen duty and strategy and fear over the one genuine connection he had felt in 2 decades. He had made his choice, and now someone else was making a different one. "She is not mine to grant or withhold," he heard himself say, the words tasting like ash. "She is her own person. If she chooses to leave, I have no authority to stop her." It was the right answer, the honorable answer, and it felt like cutting out his own heart. The rival emperor stood. "Thank you for your honesty," he said. "I want you to know, I see her. Not as a servant. Not as someone beneath consideration. I see her as someone of value, someone worthy of being chosen without hesitation or condition. And if she will have me, I intend to give her everything you were too afraid to offer." The words weren't cruel. They were simply true. And truth, the great emperor was learning, could cut deeper than any insult. After the rival emperor left, he sat alone in his study, staring at the empty fireplace she used to tend, and felt the full weight of what he had done. He had convinced himself that pushing her away was protection, that maintaining distance was strength, that choosing duty over feeling was the mark of a true emperor. But sitting there in the cold silence, he finally understood what he had really done. He hadn't protected her. He had abandoned her. He hadn't been strong. He had been a coward. And now he was going to watch another man claim the only thing in his entire empire that had ever made him feel human. Because that's what emperors did. They made choices, and then they lived with the consequences, even when those consequences hollowed them out from the inside. The great emperor began seeing them together. Not deliberately. He wasn't following them, wasn't spying, but the palace was only so large, and when you knew what to look for, patterns became impossible to ignore. The rival emperor had stopped pretending his presence in certain parts of the palace was coincidental. He would wait for her in the gardens during her brief moments of rest. He would find her in hallways between tasks, and she, slowly but unmistakably, had stopped trying to avoid him. The great emperor would catch glimpses of them talking in quiet corners, her posture gradually relaxing from the rigid tension she carried around everyone else. His attention focused on her with an intensity that made it clear she was not a passing curiosity, but something far more significant. And what made it unbearable was how careful the rival emperor was with her, how patient, how willing to let her set the pace of whatever was growing between them. One afternoon, the great emperor stood on a balcony overlooking the eastern gardens and watched them sit together on a stone bench beneath the flowering trees. The rival emperor was speaking, his hands gesturing gently as he told some story the great emperor couldn't hear from this distance. And she was laughing, actually laughing, her hand covering her mouth in that unconscious gesture people make when joy surprises them. The great emperor had never heard her laugh, had never seen her face transform with genuine happiness. In all their months of silent proximity, she had been careful, controlled, always aware of her place and the distance she needed to maintain. But here, with this other man, she was different. She was becoming herself. And the great emperor realized with devastating clarity that he had never given her permission to be that person around him, had never created a space safe enough for her to let down her guard. He had wanted her presence, had craved the comfort she brought, but he had never actually wanted her to be free. The rival emperor had begun making his intentions clear to the court. Not explicitly, he was too diplomatic for that, but through 1,000 small actions that spoke louder than any declaration. He requested her presence at gatherings where servants weren't typically included, introducing her to members of his delegation as someone whose opinion he valued. He asked her to recommend books to visiting scholars, publicly acknowledging her knowledge. He made space for her at tables where she would normally serve, creating a quiet revolution in palace protocol that everyone noticed, but no one dared question. Because he was an emperor, and emperors could rewrite rules if they chose to. The great emperor watched this social transformation happening, watched his rival carefully elevating her status through nothing more than consistent, visible regard, and felt something close to awe mixed with his rage. This was power used differently. Not to dominate or control, but to protect and elevate. It was everything he could have done but hadn't. The whispers started circulating through the palace. Servants talked, courtiers speculated. Everyone could see what was developing, even if no formal announcement had been made. The rival emperor was going to claim her. The question wasn't if, but when and how. Some whispered that it was a strategic move, a way to humiliate the great emperor by taking something from his household. But anyone who actually watched them together knew that wasn't true. There was nothing calculated about the way the rival emperor looked at her. Nothing political about the gentleness in his voice when he spoke to her. This wasn't strategy. This was a man who had found something valuable and was willing to do whatever it took to honor that value. And she was beginning to believe it. Beginning to trust that this wasn't temporary kindness or a game she didn't understand. The great emperor could see it in the way she carried herself now, with less of that defensive crouch, less of that expectation of abandonment. She was allowing herself to hope, and hope looked beautiful on her. His future empress noticed. During one of their strategic meetings about the wedding, she set down the documents she had been reviewing and looked at him with those sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "The rival emperor is going to make an offer for one of your servants," she said, her tone neutral and observational. "I assume you're aware?" He kept his face carefully blank. "I'm aware." She studied him for a moment longer. "And you're going to allow it?" The question carried no judgment, just curiosity. She was trying to understand the political calculation, the strategic advantage he must be seeing that she was missing. Because surely this was about strategy. Surely a man like him wouldn't allow a rival to take something from his household unless there was a greater game being played. "I have no grounds to forbid it," he said, his voice carefully empty. "She is not my property. If she chooses to leave, that is her right." His future empress nodded slowly, accepting this answer because it fit the image of the man she thought she was marrying: practical, unemotional, driven entirely by logic. She had no way of knowing that beneath that controlled exterior, he was being torn apart by a loss he had authored with his own hands. The day before the wedding, the rival emperor requested an audience before the assembled court. It was an unusual request. Most diplomatic matters had already been settled, and protocol dictated that the day before such a significant ceremony should be reserved for final preparations and private reflection. But he was an emperor, and emperors' requests were not denied. The great emperor granted the audience, assuming it would be some final formality, perhaps a public gesture of goodwill before the wedding that would bind their empires in alliance. The throne room filled with courtiers, advisors, foreign dignitaries, and nobles from across the realm. His future empress sat beside him, regal and composed. The rival emperor entered with his usual calm dignity, but there was something different about him today. A kind of certainty that radiated from him like heat. He walked to the center of the hall, bowed with perfect respect, and then did something no one expected. He asked for her to be brought before the court. The request sent a ripple of confusion through the assembled crowd. Servants were not summoned to imperial audiences. They existed in the background, invisible and voiceless, their presence acknowledged only when their function was required. But the rival emperor stood there, waiting with patient expectation, and the great emperor found himself unable to refuse. He gave the order. Minutes passed in tense silence. Then the doors opened and she entered, her face pale with confusion and fear. She had been pulled from her duties in the kitchens, still wearing her plain servant's dress, completely unprepared for this level of exposure. She walked into that massive hall filled with the most powerful people in the empire, and the great emperor could see her trembling, could see the way she kept her eyes down, her shoulders hunched, every instinct screaming at her to make herself smaller, to disappear. She reached the center of the hall and dropped into the lowest bow she could manage, her forehead nearly touching the marble floor, waiting for whatever judgment or command was about to fall on her. The rival emperor moved toward her, his steps measured and deliberate. He stopped directly in front of her and did something that made the entire court gasp. He knelt. An emperor, kneeling before a servant, in front of hundreds of witnesses. "Please stand," he said gently. She didn't move at first, too shocked to process what was happening. He repeated the request, his voice warm and encouraging. Slowly, trembling visibly now, she rose to her feet. Still couldn't meet his eyes. Still looked like she wanted to sink through the floor and disappear forever. But she stood, and the rival emperor, still kneeling, spoke words that would be repeated across both empires for generations to come. "I have traveled across the known world," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "I have met queens and princesses, warriors and scholars, women of great power and influence. But I have never met anyone who carries herself with the quiet dignity you possess, who sees the world with your depth of understanding, who moves through life with your gentle strength." He reached into his robes and withdrew a small box, opening it to reveal a ring, not ostentatious or heavy with jewels, but beautifully crafted, clearly precious. "I am asking you, before all these witnesses, to come with me to my empire, not as a servant, not as someone I am claiming through power or authority, but as my chosen consort, as the woman I wish to stand beside, as someone I see and value and will honor for the rest of my life. The silence in the throne room was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. The great emperor sat frozen on his throne, watching this impossible scene unfold, feeling something inside him crack and splinter. This was a declaration unlike anything the court had ever witnessed. The rival emperor wasn't just offering her a better position, he was offering her dignity, recognition, the right to be chosen publicly, without shame or hesitation. He was giving her everything the great emperor had been too afraid to give. And he was doing it in front of everyone, making it impossible to pretend this was anything other than what it was, love offered without condition or calculation. She stood there shaking, tears streaming down her face, unable to speak. The rival emperor waited, patient and unhurried, still kneeling before her like she was the one with power and he was the one asking for mercy. Finally, in a voice so quiet the entire court had to strain to hear it, she whispered, "Why?" It was the same question the great emperor had been asking himself. Why would an emperor do this? Why risk political embarrassment? Why make such a public declaration for someone the world considered worthless? The rival emperor's answer was simple. Because from the moment I saw you, I recognized something the rest of the world had failed to see. You are not invisible. You have never been invisible. And I refuse to live in a world where I pretend otherwise. You deserve to be chosen, and I am choosing you. The only question is whether you will choose me in return. He held out the ring, his hand steady, his eyes on hers with an intensity that made his devotion unmistakable. The entire empire held its breath, waiting for her answer, waiting to see if a servant girl would accept an emperor's heart. She looked at the rival emperor kneeling before her, at the ring he offered, at the impossible future he was placing in her trembling hands. Then, for the first time since entering that hall, she lifted her eyes and looked directly at the great emperor. Their gazes met across the crowded throne room, across the unbridgeable distance of choices made and opportunities lost, and something passed between them that no one else could see. It wasn't accusation. It wasn't anger. It was simply recognition. She was seeing him clearly, perhaps for the first time, seeing him not as the powerful emperor she had once served, not as the man who had given her books and quiet mornings, but as someone who had been given a choice and had chosen fear. And he was seeing her too, really seeing her, understanding too late what he had thrown away. The moment lasted only seconds, but it contained entire conversations they would never have, entire futures that would never exist, entire versions of themselves that might have been if either of them had been braver. Then she turned back to the rival emperor, still kneeling, still waiting with that infinite patience, and something in her posture changed. The hunched, defensive crouch began to straighten. The trembling started to still. She took a breath, deep and steadying, and when she spoke, her voice was stronger than anyone had ever heard it. "I have spent my entire life being invisible," she said, and the hall was so quiet that every word carried like a bell. "I learned to take up no space, to want nothing, to expect nothing. I learned that hoping to be chosen was the fastest path to heartbreak, and I believed for so long that this was simply how the world worked, that people like me existed to serve people like you, and that was the natural order of things." She paused, and tears were still streaming down her face, but her voice didn't waver. "But you have shown me something different. You have shown me that being chosen isn't about luck or status or deserving, it's about someone being brave enough to see value where others refuse to look." She reached out with a shaking hand and took the ring from his palm. The court erupted in gasps and whispers, the sound like wind rushing through trees. She held the ring for a moment, looking at it as if it were made of light rather than metal, and then she slipped it onto her own finger, because her hands were steadier than his in that moment. "Yes," she said, the word clear and certain and impossible to misunderstand. "I choose you too." The rival emperor rose to his feet, and without hesitation, without concern for the hundreds of watching eyes, he pulled her into an embrace. Not possessive, not triumphant, just profoundly grateful, as if she had given him something infinitely more valuable than she had received. and she, who had spent years learning not to take up space, allowed herself to be held, allowed herself to believe, finally, that she was worth choosing. The hall erupted in applause, in celebration, in the kind of joy that comes from witnessing something genuinely beautiful and unexpected. Everyone was smiling, moved by the romance of it, the drama of an emperor claiming a servant before the entire court. Everyone except the great emperor. He sat motionless on his throne, his face a mask of imperial composure, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He watched them embrace, watched her smile through her tears, watched the rival emperor look at her like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking his entire life. And he felt something inside himself die. Not dramatically, not with pain or rage or any of the emotions he might have expected, just a quiet, cold death of possibility. He had told himself over the past weeks that he could endure this, that he would watch her leave with grace and dignity, that he had made his choice and would live with it like the emperor he was. But actually seeing it happen, actually witnessing the moment she chose someone else, chose the life he could have given her but hadn't, was different from imagining it. It was watching the last door close on a room he would never enter. It was understanding, with absolute finality, that some losses cannot be undone. His future empress leaned slightly toward him, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "That was unexpected," she murmured, her tone carrying the faintest edge of something that might have been sympathy, or might have been calculation. "Will this complicate our alliance?" Even now, even watching him lose the only thing that had made him feel human in 20 years, she was thinking about politics and strategy, and he couldn't even blame her. This was what he had chosen. This was the kind of partnership he had deemed acceptable. A union built on mutual benefit and shared goals, completely devoid of anything that might resemble genuine feeling. "No," he said, his voice steady despite the emptiness spreading through his chest. "If anything, it strengthens our position. The rival emperor will be bound to us through gratitude and personal connection. It's a favorable outcome." The words tasted like poison, but they were true. In purely strategic terms, this was good for the empire. His empire would be secure. His future would be stable. He would have everything a ruler could want, everything except the one thing that had ever made the weight of the crown feel bearable. The celebration that erupted in the throne room continued for hours. The rival emperor's delegation rejoiced at their emperor's unexpected announcement. Courtiers whispered excitedly about the romance of it all, already composing songs and stories about the emperor who knelt before a servant. Foreign dignitaries congratulated the rival emperor on his choice, praising his unconventional heart and bold disregard for tradition. And through it all, she stood beside him, still trembling slightly, still adjusting to the reality that her entire life had transformed in the span of minutes. The rival emperor kept her close, his hand resting gently on her back, introducing her to nobles and diplomats as his future consort, his voice filled with pride that required no performance. He was genuinely happy, and she was beginning to believe that happiness might actually be something she was allowed to feel. The great emperor watched all of this from his throne, maintaining perfect composure, accepting congratulations with gracious nods, playing his role flawlessly while dying inside. When the formal audience finally ended and the crowd began to disperse, the rival emperor approached the throne one last time. She was with him, still looking overwhelmed but standing straighter now, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm. They stopped at the appropriate distance and bowed with respect. "Thank you," the rival emperor said, his voice sincere, "for allowing this to happen, for not standing in the way of what we both knew to be right." The great emperor looked at them standing there together and saw the future they would build, a future of partnership and genuine affection, of conversations and shared mornings, of all the small intimacies he had wanted but been too afraid to claim. "I wish you both great happiness," he said, the formal words coming automatically. Then, because he was still an emperor and emperors maintained dignity even in devastation, he added, "She deserves to be cherished. I trust you understand the value of what you've been given." The rival emperor met his eyes and nodded slowly, understanding completely what was being said beneath the careful language. "I do," he said quietly, "and I will honor it every day for the rest of my life." She had been silent through this exchange, her eyes lowered, but now she looked up at the great emperor one final time. There was no anger in her gaze, no triumph. Just a quiet sadness, as if she understood that they were both casualties of his fear, that they had both lost something that might have been beautiful if either of them had been brave enough to reach for it when it mattered. "Thank you," she said softly, "for the books, for the mornings, for seeing me, even if only for a little while." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything unspoken. All the conversations they never had, all the possibilities he had closed before they could open, all the ways he had almost chosen her but ultimately hadn't. He wanted to say something. Wanted to tell her that she had been the only light in 20 years of darkness, that every morning without her had felt like suffocation. That he was sorry, so desperately sorry, for being too damaged and too afraid to give her what she deserved. But emperors didn't apologize for strategic decisions, and he had spent so long being an emperor that he no longer knew how to be anything else. "You're welcome," he said instead, the words inadequate and hollow. And then they were gone, swept back into the celebrating crowd, moving toward a future that would unfold far from his empire and his reach. He sat alone on his throne, surrounded by hundreds of people, and felt the silence crushing down on him like physical weight. His advisors approached with final details about tomorrow's wedding. His future empress reviewed timelines with her characteristic efficiency. Musicians rehearsed ceremonial songs in the distance. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. His empire was secure. His legacy was assured. His choice had been the strategic one, the smart one, the one that prioritized duty over personal desire. He had done everything right. So why did it feel like he had just made the greatest mistake of his life? Why did success taste like ashes? Why did the crown on his head feel heavier than it had ever felt before? That night, he returned to his private chambers and stood at the window overlooking the city he ruled. Somewhere out there, in the guest quarters of the palace, she was beginning her new life, learning what it felt like to be chosen without hesitation, discovering that the world could be kind if you found the right person to share it with. And he was preparing to marry a woman he respected but would never love, to produce heirs who would inherit an empire but never know their father's heart, to spend the rest of his life exactly as he had spent the last 20 years, alone in a crowd, powerful and feared and completely empty. He had told himself that attachment was weakness, that caring was vulnerability, that the only way to protect himself was to keep everyone at a distance. And now, standing in the cold darkness of his victory, he finally understood the truth. Isolation wasn't strength. It was just another kind of death. A slow, suffocating death that left you breathing but not alive, present but not real, ruling everything while mattering to no one. He had conquered the known world, and in doing so, he had lost the only battle that actually mattered, the battle against his own fear. The wedding day arrived with all the grandeur the empire could muster. The sky was perfectly clear, as if the gods themselves had blessed the union. The palace gleamed with fresh decorations, flowers imported from distant lands, silks in imperial colors draped across every surface, musicians positioned throughout the grounds to fill the air with celebration. Thousands of guests filled the ceremonial courtyard. Nobles and dignitaries from across the known world gathered to witness the joining of two great houses. The great emperor dressed in his ceremonial robes heavy with embroidery and symbols of power, the weight of them familiar and suffocating. Servants moved around him with practiced efficiency, adjusting clasps and arranging fabric, their faces carefully neutral. None of them were her. None of them had her quiet grace or intuitive awareness. They were simply doing their jobs, and he was simply a body to be prepared for display. When they finished, he looked in the mirror and saw exactly what he expected: an emperor, flawless and untouchable and completely alone. The ceremony itself was a masterwork of protocol and tradition. He stood at the altar as his bride approached, her robes even more elaborate than his, her face serene and beautiful and empty of any emotion beyond practiced composure. She was playing her role perfectly, just as he was playing his. They spoke the ancient vows that bound empires together, their voices clear and steady, their words carrying to the furthest edges of the crowd. When it came time to place the ceremonial crowns, symbols of their shared rule, on each other's heads, their hands moved with synchronized precision. Everything was perfect. Everything was exactly as it should be. And he felt absolutely nothing. No joy, no satisfaction, not even relief that the long political dance was finally complete. Just a vast, echoing emptiness, as if he were watching someone else's life unfold from a great distance. The crowd erupted in applause when the final blessing was spoken. Musicians played triumphant fanfares. Rose petals fell from balconies above. Everyone was celebrating, everyone except the man at the center of it all. The feast that followed was equally elaborate. Tables stretched across multiple halls, laden with delicacies from every corner of the empire. Wine flowed freely. Performers entertained with acrobatics and music. Nobles competed to offer the most eloquent toasts, praising the wisdom of the union, the strength of the alliance, the bright future that surely awaited. The great emperor and his new empress sat at the high table side by side, accepting congratulations with gracious nods and appropriate words. They made a striking couple, both beautiful, both powerful, both utterly controlled. To everyone watching, they embodied everything an imperial marriage should be. But sitting next to her, the great emperor felt like he was sealed in ice. She spoke when necessary, smiled when expected, touched his arm with practiced affection during toasts. And he responded in kind, playing his part in this performance they would maintain for the rest of their lives. Neither of them was unhappy. Neither of them was happy. They simply existed together in a carefully managed neutrality that would serve the empire well and satisfy neither of them at all. Midway through the feast, he saw them. The rival emperor and his newly claimed consort, seated among the honored guests, sharing a quiet conversation that seemed to exist in its own bubble despite the chaos around them. She was wearing different clothes now, still simple compared to the elaborate gowns of the noblewomen, but clearly finer than anything she had owned before, chosen with care by someone who wanted her to feel beautiful. And she did look beautiful. Not because of the clothes, but because of the way she carried herself, like someone who was finally allowing herself to take up space in the world. The rival emperor leaned close to whisper something in her ear, and she laughed. That same genuine laugh the great emperor had witnessed from the balcony, and something inside him shattered all over again. They looked happy, genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy. And watching them, he understood with brutal clarity what he had traded away. He had chosen this, the elaborate ceremony, the strategic alliance, the cold partnership with a woman who would never know him. And in making that choice, he had given away the only chance he would ever have at something real. His new empress noticed his gaze and followed it to the rival emperor's table. She studied them for a moment, her expression thoughtful and unreadable. Then she turned back to him and spoke quietly, her words meant only for him. "Do you regret it?" The question was direct and unexpected, cutting through all the diplomatic language they usually employed. He could have lied. Could have maintained the fiction that emperors didn't indulge in regret, that personal feelings were irrelevant to matters of state. But sitting there, dressed in ceremonial robes that felt like a costume, celebrating a union that felt like a funeral, he found he didn't have the energy for more pretense. "Yes," he said simply. She nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. "So do I," she admitted, her voice carrying no bitterness, just tired honesty. "Not about you specifically, but about all of this. About choosing duty over the possibility of something genuine." They sat in silence after that, two people bound together by strategy and tradition, watching other people celebrate a happiness neither of them would ever experience. And the great emperor realized that his new empress was just as trapped as he was, just as alone in her carefully maintained control. They would rule together. They would produce heirs. They would maintain the empire. And they would both die never knowing what it felt like to be truly chosen. The celebrations continued for 3 days, as tradition demanded. There were tournaments and performances, diplomatic meetings disguised as social gatherings, endless toasts to the future of the unified empires. And through it all, the great emperor played his role with mechanical perfection, accepting congratulations, making appropriate speeches, standing beside his new empress as they presented a united front to the world. But on the third evening, as the festivities were finally winding down, word came that the rival emperor and his delegation would be departing the following morning. They had stayed longer than originally planned, extending their visit to attend the wedding out of diplomatic courtesy. But now they were returning to their own empire, taking her with them. She would leave this palace, this city, this entire realm, and he would never see her again. The knowledge sat in his chest like a stone, cold and immovable. This was the final separation, the irreversible ending. That night, unable to sleep, he found himself walking through the empty corridors of the palace. His new empress had retired to her own chambers. They maintained separate quarters, as many political marriages did, another symbol of the careful distance they had negotiated. The palace was quiet, most of the guests and servants finally resting after days of celebration. He walked without conscious destination, his feet carrying him along familiar paths. And then he found himself standing outside the library, the place where so much had begun and ended. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room was dark except for moonlight streaming through tall windows, illuminating rows of books that held knowledge spanning centuries. He walked to the shelf where he had first given her a book, where he had watched her fingers trace spines with hungry longing, where he had made the first small choice that could have led somewhere different if he had been brave enough to follow it. He wasn't alone. She was there, standing in front of the same shelf, her hand resting on the spine of a book he recognized, one of the histories she had said she loved, about empires that rose and fell. She must have heard him enter, but she didn't turn around immediately. Jess stood there in the moonlit darkness, and he knew without asking that she had come here for the same reason he had, to say goodbye to something that had never quite been real, but had mattered more than most things that were. Finally, she turned to face him. No bow, no lowered eyes, no performance of subservience. Just two people standing in a quiet room, looking at each other with the weight of everything unspoken between them. "I wanted to see it one more time," she said softly. This room, where everything felt possible, even if only for a little while. Her words carried no accusation, no bitterness, just quiet acknowledgement of what they had both lost. "I'm sorry," he said, the words coming before he could stop them, raw and unguarded in a way emperors never allowed themselves to be. "For all of it. For not being brave enough to choose you when it mattered. For pushing you away because I was afraid of what caring about you might cost me. For making you feel invisible when you were the only thing in my entire empire that made me feel alive." The confession spilled out of him like water from a broken dam, all the things he should have said weeks ago, months ago, when there was still time to matter. She listened without interrupting, tears sliding silently down her face, and when he finally fell silent, she stepped closer. Not all the way, just close enough that he could see every detail of her face in the moonlight. "I would have chosen you too," she whispered. "If you had asked. If you had given me even the smallest indication that I mattered to you as more than a comfortable presence. I would have chosen you despite the impossibility of it, despite everything the world said about our different places. Because you saw me. For a little while, you really saw me." "But you didn't ask," she continued, her voice gentle but unflinching. "You kept me close enough to feel safe but far enough to avoid risk. And I can't build a life on someone's inability to choose me. The rival emperor, he isn't you. He doesn't know the things about me that you know. We don't have the history we built in quiet mornings and unspoken understanding. But he looked at me and decided, without hesitation, that I was worth choosing publicly, worth defending, worth honoring before the entire world. And that's what I needed. Not someone who cared for me in private, but rejected me in practice. Someone who was willing to stand beside me without shame or calculation." She reached out and touched his face just once, her fingers light against his cheek. "I hope you find peace," she said. "I hope you learn, somehow, that protecting yourself from loss also protects you from everything worth living for. I hope you become someone who can love without fear, even if I'm not the one who gets to see it." Then she pulled her hand back, picked up the book she had been holding, and walked past him toward the door. He let her go. Didn't call her back. Didn't make promises he couldn't keep or declarations that came too late to change anything. He just stood there in the empty library and felt her absence like a wound that would never fully heal. The weeks that followed her departure settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and fundamentally wrong. The great emperor returned to the routines that had defined his life for decades, reviewing military reports at dawn, hearing petitions from nobles and commoners, making decisions that affected millions of lives, ruling his empire with the same cold efficiency that had made him feared and respected across the known world. His new empress proved to be exactly what he had expected: intelligent, strategic, capable of managing the complex politics of court with grace and precision. They worked well together, two minds aligned on matters of state, two rulers committed to maintaining the empire's strength and stability. They shared meals when protocol demanded it. They appeared together at public events, presenting a united front that satisfied the court and reassured foreign powers. They discussed succession and began the careful process of producing heirs, approaching even intimacy as another duty to be fulfilled with competence rather than passion. It was everything a political marriage should be, and it felt like living inside a tomb. The empire thrived under their joint rule. Trade expanded, borders stabilized. The military remained strong and well-supplied. Rebellions were crushed before they could gain momentum. Justice was administered with fairness and consistency. Every metric that measured imperial success showed improvement. The great emperor's advisors praised his wisdom in choosing such a capable partner. Foreign diplomats spoke admiringly of the strength of the alliance. Historians would later write that this period marked the height of the empire's power, a golden age of prosperity and peace. But the man at the center of it all felt nothing. He would sit in council meetings and hear reports of victories and accomplishments, and the words would wash over him like water over stone, making no impression, stirring no feeling. He had spent 20 years building walls around his heart to protect himself from loss, and now those walls were so high and so thick that nothing could reach him anymore. Not satisfaction, not pride, not even the small pleasures that had once made ruling bearable. He existed in a state of perfect numbness, functioning flawlessly while feeling nothing at all. Letters arrived periodically from the rival emperor's court, diplomatic correspondence that maintained the alliance between their empires. The great emperor read them with professional attention, noting political developments and responding with appropriate courtesy. But sometimes, embedded in discussions of trade routes and military cooperation, there would be small personal details. Mentions of festivals celebrated in the Eastern Empire, references to new cultural initiatives, and occasionally, carefully worded updates that everyone at court understood were really about her. She had established schools for children in the lower districts. She had convinced the rival emperor to implement policies that protected servants from abuse. She was learning statecraft, not because she had to, but because she wanted to understand the world she now helped govern. The rival emperor wrote about her with obvious pride and affection, his words making it clear that she wasn't just his consort in name, but his genuine partner, someone whose opinions he valued and whose happiness he actively cultivated. Reading these letters felt like pressing on a bruise, painful and perversely compelling. The great emperor would finish them and set them aside and return to his own empty partnership, and the contrast would sit in his chest like a weight. His new empress noticed, of course. She noticed everything. One evening, after a particularly long day of diplomatic meetings, she entered his study uninvited, a rare breach of the careful boundaries they maintained. She poured 2 cups of wine and sat across from him, her expression thoughtful rather than confrontational. "We need to talk about what this is," she said without preamble. "This marriage, this partnership, what we're actually doing here." He looked at her, this brilliant woman he respected but would never love, and waited. "I thought I could be content with this," she continued, "with a union built on shared goals and mutual respect. I thought that was enough. But watching you these past months, watching you go through the motions of ruling while looking like you're slowly dying inside, I've realized something. We're both too young to spend the rest of our lives like this, too intelligent, too capable of more." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I'm not suggesting we dissolve the marriage. The political consequences would be catastrophic. But perhaps we could acknowledge, just between us, that this isn't what either of us wanted. That we're both making the best of a situation we chose for all the wrong reasons." He found himself speaking more honestly than he had in months. I don't know how to be anything other than what I am. I don't know how to want things anymore. I spent so long convincing myself that desire was weakness, that caring about anything gave the world power to destroy me, that I think I actually succeeded. I killed the part of myself that could want, and now I'm ruling the greatest empire in the world, and I feel nothing. Not satisfaction, not pride, just emptiness. His empress looked at him with something that might have been pity or might have been recognition. I understand, she said quietly. More than you know. But here's what I've learned. Watching you mourn someone you never even had. The walls you built to protect yourself didn't make you strong. They just made you alone. And being alone isn't the same as being safe. It's just another kind of suffering. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. She's happy, you know. The letters make that clear. She found someone brave enough to choose her without fear or calculation. And that's probably the best ending this story could have had. Not for you, but for her. And maybe that has to be enough. She left him sitting in the empty study, her words echoing in the silence, forcing him to confront a truth he had been avoiding. He had lost her. That was irreversible. But the real question was whether he would spend the rest of his life locked in the prison he had built, or whether he could find some way to become someone different, someone capable of feeling again, even if those feelings came too late to change what mattered most. Years passed. The empire continued to flourish under the joint rule of the great emperor and his empress. They produced 2 heirs, children who would one day inherit the vast realm their parents had maintained and expanded. The children were raised by nurses and tutors, seen by their parents at scheduled intervals, given every advantage except genuine warmth. The great emperor watched them grow with a distant appreciation, noting their intelligence and strength, but never quite connecting with them in any meaningful way. He had learned too well how to keep people at arm's length, even his own blood. His empress proved to be an excellent mother in the same way she was an excellent ruler, competent, strategic, ensuring the children received everything they needed while maintaining appropriate emotional distance. They were raising the next generation of emperors exactly as they had been raised, perpetuating a cycle of isolation and duty that stretched back generations. And the great emperor knew, watching his children play in the palace gardens under the watchful eyes of their attendants, that he was passing on his own brokenness like an inheritance. The rival emperor's letters continued to arrive over the years, though less frequently as both empires settled into comfortable stability. Sometimes they included news about her. She had given birth to children of her own, 3 daughters who were apparently being raised very differently from how imperial children were typically handled. The rival emperor wrote about teaching them himself, about meals shared as a family, about his consort insisting that their daughters learn not just statecraft, but empathy, not just strategy, but genuine human connection. He wrote about her work expanding educational opportunities across his empire, about programs she had initiated to protect the vulnerable, about the way she had transformed his court culture simply by refusing to accept that power required cruelty. The great emperor read these updates and felt something he hadn't expected. Not jealousy anymore, but a kind of bittersweet pride. She had taken everything she learned from being invisible and used it to make sure others would be seen. She had transformed her pain into purpose. She had become exactly who she was meant to be, just not with him. One day, nearly a decade after her departure, an unexpected letter arrived. It was written in her own hand, addressed to him personally, rather than sent through official diplomatic channels. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, the first direct communication from her since the night in the library. The letter was brief and carefully worded, but beneath the formal language he could hear her voice. She wrote that she was happy, that her life had unfolded in ways she never imagined possible, that she was grateful for the path that had led her to where she was. But she also wrote something that cut through all his defenses. "I have forgiven you," she said, "because I understand now what I couldn't understand then. You were doing the best you could with the wounds you carried. You were protecting yourself in the only way you knew how. It wasn't enough. It hurt me deeply, but it wasn't malicious. It was just fear. And I hope, wherever you are now, that you have found some way to heal. That you have learned that surviving isn't the same as living. That power means nothing if it costs you your humanity." He read the letter 3 times, then burned it as protocol demanded for personal correspondence. But the words stayed with him, burrowing into places he thought he had sealed off forever. She had forgiven him, had seen his brokenness clearly, and chosen to release both of them from the weight of what might have been. And her forgiveness felt simultaneously like a gift and a mirror, forcing him to see himself not as he pretended to be, but as he actually was. A man who had let fear turn him into something less than human. He was the great emperor. He ruled more territory than any leader in history. He had wealth beyond measure, power beyond challenge, a legacy that would be remembered for centuries. And yet he had lost the only battle that actually mattered. The battle to remain someone capable of genuine connection, someone who could love and be loved without the armor of strategy and control. She had moved on, had built a beautiful life, had become someone who used power to protect rather than isolate. And he remained exactly where he had always been, alone at the top of the world, untouchable, unbreakable, and utterly, devastatingly empty. The great emperor stood on the same balcony where this story had begun, looking out over his empire as the sun set over the capital. Everything he could see belonged to him. Every light flickering in the darkness below represented someone who obeyed his commands, feared his displeasure, depended on his rule. He had conquered nations, crushed enemies, built something that would outlast him by generations. But standing there in the gathering darkness, he finally understood what he had traded for all of it. He had traded the possibility of being known, of being chosen not for his power but for himself, of waking up beside someone who saw him, really saw him, and stayed anyway. He had convinced himself that safety required isolation, that strength meant never needing anyone. But she had shown him, by choosing someone else, that real strength was the courage to be vulnerable, to want something, to risk loss for the possibility of connection. And he had failed that test. Not because he was weak, but because he had been too afraid to try. The sun disappeared below the horizon, leaving him standing in darkness that felt appropriate and final. He would continue ruling, would continue making decisions and winning battles and expanding his empire, would continue being the great emperor until the day he died. But he would do it knowing that he had been offered something precious, something real and genuine and transformative, and he had let it slip through his fingers because he was too broken to recognize its value until it was gone. That was his true legacy, not the empire, not the conquest. But the woman who had loved him quietly and left with grace, who had forgiven him without needing his apology, who had become someone extraordinary while he remained exactly who he had always been, alone, powerful, and learning, far too late, that some losses cannot be undone, no matter how much you wish you could go back and choose differently.